Before the Bible was sealed, there was war in the heavens, and war over truth. There is a book, the Prophets, buried a text torn from sacred scrolls because it spoke too plainly of angels who lusted bloodlines corrupted and secrets mankind was never meant to hold. The Book of Enoch, hidden by kings, feared by priests, whispered about by those who remember the vibration of divine law. You were never meant to find it, but here you are, watching, listening, feeling the ancient betrayal stir in your bones. What did Enoch see that made the watchers fall? Stay close. The veil is thin. They sanctified the silence. They declared the vision too vast, the truth too uncontainable, the prophet too alive. And so they buried him. Enoch, scribe of heaven, confidant of angels, walker between the worlds, was not forgot. He was erased, not from memory but from permission, not from faith but from law. His words, steeped in flame and sky, were caught in the snare of doctrine. Shrines crumbled, scrolls burned. And the Book of Enoch, once revered beside Moses and Isaiah, was cast into shadow. But why? Why did this book, this witness of celestial crime and divine judgment, alarm the keepers of the sacred so deeply? We must answer not with opinion but with history. The earliest known Book of Enoch, often called 1 Enoch, emerged in Old Testament times, portions traceable to the 3rd century BCE. Its presence lingered like smoke in the fires of Judean thought drifting through the Essene sect at Qumran. Yes, the same community who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, those silent rebels who hid their scriptures in caves, knowing their theology would soon be torched by Rome and the temple elite alike. Fragments of Enoch's vision were found with them, earthquake-inducing verses etched into brittle parchment alongside Leviticus and Isaiah. For them, Enoch wasn't heresy. He was essential. And yet, when the councils came, those gatherings of robe and rule like the Council of Laodicea in 363 CE or the great weight of the synods that followed, the Book of Enoch was absent. Not questioned, not discussed, silenced, as if the clergy feared that opening its pages would split the temple veil anew, because it wasn't just a matter of theology, it was a matter of sovereignty. Enoch's visions challenged the divine order. Angels faltering, giants born of transgression, realms beyond mortal comprehension, and a human taken into heaven crowned not by men but by God himself. Let that echo, taken into heaven without dying. A theme so radical even centuries later it tingled through the New Testament, where the Epistle of Jude, verse 14, quotes Enoch directly, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints." A flash of remembrance in a canon that had already zipped its lips. But you won't hear that in most pulpits. You won't find Enoch on Grandma's bookshelf beside Psalms and Proverbs, because law drew a curtain, not to protect truth, but to protect control. The veil was draped not to shield humanity from danger, but to shield the shepherds from inquiry. What would happen if people read of watchers who fell, not in pride like Lucifer, but in lust for mortal bloodlines? What if the faithful saw God judging even his heavenly court? What happens to hierarchy when heaven itself is called to trial? No council ever said. They simply omitted, and by omitting they set the fire. And yet the ash speaks. Ethiopia's Orthodox Church preserved Enoch like a lantern in the night. Translated into Ge'ez, it remained a living scripture while the West crossed its arms and turned its gaze elsewhere. If the scribes had feared only error, they would have corrected him. But they exiled him. What kind of truth needs to be buried to be controlled? Or more hauntingly, what kind of God allows prophets to be silenced only to call them back when the world nears collapse? A covenant once sealed in starlight shattered, not on earth but in the higher courts of heaven. They descended through the clouds not in peace but in longing. The Watchers, the Grigori. They were not rebels in the eyes of men, not yet. They were angels, emissaries of the Most High, sent to observe, to watch, to remain untouched by the gravity of dust and desire. But fire knows not how to rest in stillness, and neither did they. According to the ancient book that bears his name, Enoch, the seventh from Adam, was shown what others were forbidden to see. In 1 Enoch, a text preserved in G.E. and revered in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the veil is pulled back. 200 watchers descend atop Mount Hermon, swearing an unholy oath. Not their creator's name, but their own pact, bound to one another by rebellion. They came not with war, but with promises, to teach, to reveal, to awaken. Azazel gave humanity the secrets of weapon-making, of fashioning metals into implements of war and vanity. Semjaza opened the gates of enchantments and signs, the forbidden arts wrapped in stars. In Genesis 6, their story slithers in quietly. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives, all which they chose. But that one verse, so briefly whispered, is the echo of a much louder fall. This was the rift, the covenant fractured in heaven. They were not cast out by violence. They left by choice. They traded eternity for intimacy, spirit for flesh, and in doing so made the children of earth carry a war not theirs to begin. But what broke that law? What made this descent so grievous that the heavens trembled? The Book of Enoch answers, not in philosophical terms, but in tragedy. The union of angel and woman birthed giants, Nephilim, beings too vast for this world, devouring its fruits and blood alike. The earth cried out under their weight, and heaven heard. What began as longing turned into desecration. Rabbinic literature like the Midrash and Book of Jubilees would later allude to these celestial sins, cloaking them in euphemism and lore. But Enoch gives it to us raw. The verdict was cosmic treason. For corrupting creation, the watchers were bound, imprisoned in the valleys of earth beneath jagged rocks and ancient silence. They aren't gone, they're awaiting. So why was this story sealed and exiled? Why was Enoch's voice silenced while others were canonized? Perhaps because it does not flatter, it does not soothe. It speaks of a heaven that bleeds, of angels that fail, and of men who suffocate under the weight of forgotten pacts. It says this betrayal wasn't born on earth. It fell from heaven like a thunderclap. So I ask you, if the guardians turned into the transgressors and the divine chose desire over duty, then what does that make us, their heirs in the flesh? What part do we play in a war written into the marrow of our memory, and who even now watches the watchers? They were born out of disobedience, monuments of flesh to a broken pact between heaven and earth. The Book of Enoch names them directly Nephilim, the giants. Great men of renown, said Genesis 6:4, but Enoch tears the veil, revealing they were not heroes, but abominations, born of angels who breached their station and daughters of men enticed by starlight. These beings were never meant to walk the earth, and yet for a time they ruled it. You won't find their story in Sunday sermons. You might not even find it in the Bible as you know it. But in the pages blackened with divine wrath and angelic regret, in the Book of Enoch, they rise roaring like a memory too vast to remain buried. Scholars whisper of this text preserved in Ge'ez within the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, while the West let it disappear into smoke and silence. Why? Because these giants don't fit the narrative. They burn through clean theology like fire through scrolls. They were more than tall. They were cursed. The angels, called the Watchers, descended atop Mount Hermon, a name echoed in Phoenician and Canaanite memory as a place of divine descent. There they made a covenant, not with God, but with each other. A pact to take human women, a pact to alter fate. In their union was conceived a generation that stretched the boundaries of mortal form, giants whose hunger could not be sated, who devoured beasts, men, and in time one another. The Book of Enoch chapter 7 is unflinching, and they began to sin against birds, beasts, reptiles, and fish, and to devour one another's flesh. The earth trembled beneath their weight. The flood was not merely nature's fury. It was judgment against a bloodline that shattered heaven's law. And yet, echoes remain. From the Anakim and Rephaim in Deuteronomy to Goliath, in the Book of Samuel, giant lineages flicker through the Hebrew canon like ghostly afterimages. Skeletal remains, megalithic architecture, and pancultural myth. The Norse, Yurt and the Greek, Titans, the Hindu deities, parallel this same archetype, ancient beings of vast stature fallen from time. Could it be that the world remembers them in fractured pieces? That every tale of monstrous strength, every whispered myth of lost ages and mighty beings is a shard from the same shattered mirror? But here's the most haunting part. The Nephilim were not just a danger to mankind. Their existence corrupted creation itself. They became so interwoven in the world's blood that God himself, according to Enoch, grieved the very act of making man. The Watchers were punished. The flood swept away most traces. But anything born of both heaven and earth does not die easily. Some say echoes of the Nephilim survive, not in form but in the pride, the hunger, the darkness in human ambition. The curse moves forward, unseen but not unfelt. So ask yourself, if God sent the flood for them, what happens when the world begins to look like theirs again? What if the giants were not just ancient? What if they were a pattern? And are we walking beneath their shadow once more? They chained the angels, they buried the giants, and they silenced the voice that warned them first. In the aftermath of cosmic revolt, sacred dust settled over broken thrones and shattered covenants. The world did not forget overnight. No forgetting is slower than fire. It seeps in through the cracks of doctrine. It whispers in the archives of the vanquished. And of all that was scorched, none smolders hotter than the Book of Enoch. Once revered, then exiled, now obscured beneath the weight of deliberate silence. How does a prophet vanish from the sacred memory of a people? How does a vision so vast, of angels fallen, of giants born of judgment written in the stars, sink beneath liturgy like a stone in a well? There once was a time when Enoch was not a shadow but a lamp. His book was known among the early Jewish mystics, echoed across the sands of Second Temple Judaism. The Qumran scrolls, buried beside apocalyptic sects near the Dead Sea for nearly 20 years, held fragments of this forgotten scripture. They called Enoch the scribe of righteousness, otherworldly, set apart. His visions were celestial flame made ink and form. But history is not written only by scribes. It is also curated, purged by councils. By the time church and empire clasped hands in Rome and Nicaea, and the boundaries of holy canon were nailed in place, Enoch's words were branded too wild, too dangerous, too ungovernable. His accounts of rogue angels interbreeding with humankind, of watchers cast down and chained beneath the earth. It was doctrine too volatile for empire. The Council of Laodicea in the 4th century AD marked a turning point, excluding any book deemed apocryphal, and Enoch fell with the rest. Silent ink screaming truth. And yet buried does not mean dead. For while Latin and Greek traditions turned their back, the Ethiopian church kept the fires alive. The Book of Enoch, known there as 1 Enoch, remained preserved in the ancient Ge'ez language, canonized, guarded, and read. An heirloom of stars amid burning cities. It survived not as legend but as liturgy. In that sacred corner of faith, the chains of silence could not reach. But what are chains to an angel who has seen the throne of God? From Genesis 6 to Jude 1:14, the spirit of Enoch lingers, ghost texts embedded in scripture like smoke trailing a vanished flame. Jude, the brother of Jesus, even quotes directly from Enoch, "Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones," a remnant of a revelation once embraced. So why did they turn away? Why guard the gates of heaven with omission? Were the watchers too familiar? Were the warnings too precise? The silence that followed Enoch was not absence, it was exile. And exile speaks when you learn how to listen. The angels fell. The giants perished, but their stories didn't vanish. They've been hiding in myths, echoing through tabloids and testimonies, cloaked in suspicion, burned, banned, but never erased. And if their fall was judged, what of ours? Who else have we forgotten because remembering them meant remembering what we allowed to fall? Most will never ask because most were taught to forget. But you're still listening. It begins with a silence thick as oil and older than memory, a silence not of absence but of exile. You were never meant to remember, and yet here you are. Somewhere once flames devoured scrolls not meant to burn. In a house of papyrus and prophecy, they called it the Library of Alexandria. The margins of the sacred were set ablaze. In that inferno, it is said voices not heard since Eden wept themselves into ash. And among those murmuring remains a name tried to rise, Enoch. His book was never lost. It was sealed, preserved not in light but in shadow, copied in the backrooms of Ethiopian monasteries, whispered across deserts by mystics, guarded by those who knew it wasn't safe to forget. Not safe, but necessary. The Book of Enoch, a script that dared to indict heaven, expose rebellion among immortals, and name the crime that tore the veil between worlds. Too strange for scholars, too dangerous for priests, too truthful for kings. By the time of the early church councils, Nicaea in 325 CE and Hippo in 393 CE, the gates had already been locked. The Book of Enoch, once revered among Second Temple Jews and echoed in the Epistle of Jude itself. Yes, Jude 1:14-15 quotes it outright, was cast to the periphery. Not because it wasn't ancient, but because it was too ancient. Not because it erred, but because it refused to kneel. Language was weaponized. Orthodoxy was forged. And Enoch, great-grandfather of Noah, walker with God, scribe of heaven's secrets, became the casualty of a canon afraid of its own underworld. But the Psalms of the silence do not stay buried forever. In the highlands of Ethiopia, within the sacred vault of the Beta Israel, the book still breathed. It endured in Ge'ez, bound in leather, sung in twilight, while the Western world forgot until 1773, when Scottish explorer James Bruce returned with 3 manuscript copies gripped like spoils of a forgotten war. And just like that, Enoch knocked again at the door of memory. This was no apocalyptic novelty. This was part of the architecture of early belief. The Dead Sea Scrolls, unearthed at Qumran in 1947, held fragments of one Enoch, crumbling proof that the Essenes, those desert mystics of Second Temple Judaism, held it sacred. What had been erased was now undeniable. But ask yourself, why would a text cherished by early Jews, echoed by apostles, and buried in desert stone be cast into silence? Why was Enoch, the man who was taken up, without death, made absent from the books that shaped belief? What else did he see when he walked among the stars? For when a prophecy sleeps, it does not die. It waits, curled in the soul of humanity, humming beneath doctrine carried like embers beneath ash. And now, as old flames flicker and ancient doors tremble on their hinges, you stand at the threshold of forbidden dawn. Are you ready to remember what was kept from you? It waited in the ash long after the fire was gone. A scroll wrapped in silence. A voice the world forgot. Before the Gospels were inked, before church fathers debated the shape of the sacred, there was Enoch. A man so pure tradition says he walked with God and was not, for God took him. That phrase alone in Genesis 5:24 holds a riddle smothered by millennia, taken by God, yes. But where to and why? This mystery unfurled into a revelation, the Book of Enoch, a text that once thundered from the highlands of Ethiopia to the caves of Qumran, now entombed in obscurity. Not lost, no. Silenced. A sacred record severed from the canon, not because it was false, but because it was true in ways the world wasn't ready to face. It speaks of angels fallen not just in heaven, but in purpose. of a cosmic order undone by desire, of watchers who watched too long and loved what they were told to fear. This was scripture for the sons of fire. It surged through the pulse of Second Temple Judaism, widely read by those who shaped apocalyptic thought. The Book of Jude itself, verse 14, openly quotes Enoch, calling him the seventh from Adam. Listen, this is not hidden. It is ignored. And yet, as councils formed in the 4th century, Nicaea, Laodicea, Carthage, the Book of Enoch was left outside the wall, declared too wild, too strange, too real. It spoke of dimensions not easily governed, of angelic hierarchies and punishments sealed in darkness. What the church could not tame, it dismissed. Still, it did not die. While Rome built cathedrals, monks in Ethiopia preserved these fiery pages in G's, embedding it into the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, the last church on earth to keep Enoch's name alive. Not a footnote, a foundation. And beneath ancient desert stone, the hidden ones waited. Underground sects, Essene mystics, visionaries in rag and ash. All who knew the stars held memory, and that exile was not the end. They spoke it in wind and code, in glyph and gaze, a knowing older than doctrine. And when all thought it gone, when Enlightenment thinkers declared ancient mysteries obsolete, a shepherd stumbled on scrolls buried in the Judean desert. 1947. The Dead Sea Scrolls spoke again. Among them, fragments of one Enoch, proof that this voice had always echoed in the margins, waiting to return when ears were opened. Some say the rhythm of sacred truth cannot be erased, only delayed. Like a bell struck in the heavens, its tone travels through time, too pure for metal, too resonant to vanish. It waits inside you. It waits in dreams. It waits in the gaps between sanctioned words. But here's the divine trick: Enoch isn't just a book. It's a test. The test of whether humanity still hungers for unprocessed truth. A truth that doesn't coddle. A truth that reveals angels with mouths full of prophecy and deeds stained in rebellion. So why was it cast into ash while lesser words were crowned with gold? Did we exile it, or did it leave on purpose to protect what could not yet be understood? And more urgently, now that the scroll has stirred in the dust once more, what happens if we read it, and still, they watch from below? One man, one voice cast into firelight, echoing across worlds unseen. That was Enoch, not lost but exiled, not forgotten but feared. A prophet alone before the thrones of heaven, not in rebellion but in revelation. We do not begin with myth. We begin with something older, a transcript of terror handed down by flame. The Book of Enoch was not written to be admired. It was written to shake the bones of kings and priests. Early church fathers like Tertullian revered it, claimed it was once held sacred by the faithful. Yet it vanished, not with the innocence of time. No, cut out like a tumor, its pages smoldering under councils and condemnations. It appeared in the canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and nowhere else. A spiritual orphan embraced only by those the empires could not tame. Enoch's voice was danger. His vision stirred at the seat of all heavenly dominion, wheels within wheels, thrones forged in lightning, watchers bound in pits older than Babylon. He walked with angels. He recorded their fall. He stood not at Sinai or Zion, but before the chambers where stars are named. His scrolls did not comfort. They unveiled. These were not metaphors. They were indictments, spiritual X-rays of a cosmos threaded with fracture. Contained within the Qumran caves, among the Dead Sea Scrolls unearthed in 1947, were fragments of Enoch encrypted in time. A scroll scholars believed to be myth, suddenly staring back from the dust. That alone was thunder. Proof that this was no pseudepigraphic fiction but a once sacred record buried beneath centuries of silence. And what does the book unveil? Not just the descent of angels but of judgment, of cosmic law strained to the point of rupture. Enoch is taken alive, body and soul, to witness the machine of creation from the inside. A lone man caught up before the Ancient of Days, as echoed in Daniel 7:9, where thrones are set, and the court sits in weighty silence. Enoch travels beyond the veil not as a tourist, but as a witness to indictment, to verdict, and to mercy dancing on the edge of annihilation. To see what he saw is to lose your footing in time. Little wonder it was hidden. Even in the Book of Jubilees, a 2nd century BCE text echoing Enochian themes, shadows survive. There Enoch is called the scribe of righteousness, the one who testifies to generations unborn. Not simply a prophet, but a divine archivist, a name etched across the vaults of heaven, and then nearly erased from Earth's collective breath. He walks alone among the stars because no one else dared. So ask yourself, why was this man erased from memory? Why do modern Bibles hold no trace of his road through fire and throne? What truth did he carry? That was too dangerous to canonize. Because if one man could walk with angels, if one man could witness eternity, then perhaps. So could you, but only if the thrones permit it. And still, they watch from below. It was never just excluded. It was entombed. The Book of Enoch, named for the one who walked with God and did not die, was not lost in the casual tides of time. It was sealed deliberately beneath centuries of orthodoxy and smoke. Once honored among the ancient Ethiopians and echoed in fragments by the early church fathers, it now trembles at the edge of forgetting, a holy wildfire, imprisoned beneath layers of sanctioned silence. This is the scroll that speaks when no one dares listen. Visions of watchers casting down from their celestial posts. Secrets whispered between stars and judgment poured out like thunder. A testament too dangerous for empire, too unruly for canon law. Tertullian, writing in North Africa at the turn of the 3rd century, still argued it was scripture. But by the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century, its name was already that of the exiled, unfit for liturgical reading, cast out with the Gospels that bled too brightly. And yet it survived, in one tongue, one land. In the highlands of Ethiopia, guarded by monks in hidden monasteries, the Book of Enoch was not forgotten. Preserved in Ge'ez unseen by Western eyes for over 1,000 years, it was a relic of their canon, woven into the very bones of Ethiopian Christianity. When James Bruce, a Scottish explorer, arrived in the 18th century and returned with the manuscript, Europe was stunned. Not because the book had been found, but because it had endured, like a ghost unbothered by its own burial, like a flame kept alive in a temple no longer marked on maps. And here's the paradox that must hollow your breath. This book, quoted directly in the Epistle of Jude, "Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints to execute judgment," was known, cited, even revered. Yet the door was closed on it, locked from the outside. So we must ask why. Why was a text soaked in divine visions and cosmic law treated as poison? The answer does not lie in theology alone. It lies in fear. For Enoch speaks of angels falling, not metaphorically but literally, of heavenly beings seducing flesh, of secrets of the heavens being shared with man, metallurgy, sorcery, astronomy, forbidden arts leaking into primal hands. It invokes the days before flood, when knowledge moved too fast, when divine boundaries blurred and stars fell from mapless skies. The Book of Enoch does not tell his story. It tells ours, before doctrine, before dogma, when the veil was thinner and light was dangerous. This is more than a lost book. It is a memory encrypted in spiritual DNA, a resonance buried in bone. Something ancient inside you already knows these words, though no one ever taught them. And now it stirs again, emerging not through decree but through longing. Among truth seekers, mystics, and those with ears tuned to the echo of untold things, It calls to those who have always felt the breach, something missing in the maps of heaven handed down to us. So I ask you now, as you stare into this widening abyss, if truth once hid beneath ash, what else still lies sealed in the depths? And still, they watch from below. They didn't erase the truth. They buried it beneath belief, under ash exile and centuries of sanctioned silence. The Book of Enoch, a scripture older than the fire it walked through, flickers again in the dark like smoldering parchment, carried not by priests, but by shadows. It begins not with Genesis, but with the Watchers, not with Eden, but with stars falling. A tale so luminous it scorched the doctrines that clutched at it. A prophet walks with God, angels descend with lust. And in the dance between heaven and earth, something was written that no council could bless and no tyrant could forget. This book was known, revered, cited. The Epistle of Jude in the New Testament reaches back through time and quotes Enoch, naming him, honoring him, invoking the judgment he foresaw. Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000s of his saints. This isn't lost text. It is exiled truth, disinherited by councils afraid of visions they could not interpret and refused to unravel. In Ethiopia, the echo never died. The Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserved the Book of Enoch in Ge'ez tongue like a living fossil sealed in silver. While Rome fell and Byzantium crumbled, the voice of Enoch still echoed beneath African skies. Elsewhere it vanished, swallowed by empires who curated revelation like currency. There the fire stayed lit, surrounded by incense and chant, as if the text itself demanded sanctuary. For nearly 2 millennia, the West heard only whispers, faint nods in the writings of Origen, Irenaeus, Tertullian, early church fathers wrestling with a vision too vast to dismiss, too dangerous to confirm. Tertullian in the 2nd century called the Book of Enoch, rejected by the Jews, but declared it worthy of belief, especially since it was quoted by an apostle. But time passed, and Tertullian's fire was forgotten. Then came the long silence. Centuries of liturgical amnesia stretched across lands and pulpits. Councils decided what the soul could bear. And Enoch, the man who was taken into heaven without tasting death, was nowhere to be found in the book that claimed to record all sacred breath. A conspicuous absence, a page torn deliberately. When fragments returned from the caves of Qumran in the 20th century, 2 zero-year-old shards of Aramaic parchment found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the silence cracked. The Book of Enoch had not been burned. It had been hidden, carried by shadows, kept alive by hands who knew its power was not safe in the mouths of kings. Modern scholars read these scrolls. They matched them with the Ethiopian texts. They study the cosmology, the angelology, the judgment yet to come. But something older stirs in the bones, because this isn't just literature. It's a memory too precise to be fictional, too prophetic to be accidental, like a vibration buried in the marrow until the age of forgetting ends. Something beneath the surface begins to hum. What else have we misnamed as myth because it frightened the architects of doctrine? When Scripture returns from the shadows, does it bring salvation or ignition? The ash remembers, do you? And still, they watch from below. It begins with smoke, not incense but ash. The kind that drifts from burning parchment from libraries set ablaze by empire and fear. In the ancient silence after fire, one name refuses to vanish: Enoch. A man who walked with God and was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:24 whispers that line like it's hiding a deeper crime. Because what did Enoch see before he was taken? What did he write that the world was told to forget? What flickers behind the veil of canon? Is this the Book of Enoch once read aloud in synagogues beside the Torah, quoted by the Epistle of Jude in the New Testament itself, then erased? Severed from Scripture, buried beneath the counsels of men and the centuries they commanded. But writings don't vanish, they fracture, scattered like seeds across the thresholds of time. Every fragment breathes, waiting for the right silence to be heard. The Ethiopian church stands as the last keeper, preserving one Enoch in Giez like a flame under glass. Elsewhere, silence, not ignorance, but removal. This was not the forgetfulness of time, but the will of timekeepers. By the time Origen and Tertullian spoke of Enoch's words with reverence, it was already slipping into shadow. And by the 4th century, when the Council of Laodicea listed the official books, Enoch was nowhere to be found. Not rejected with noise, but dismissed with quiet precision, like the closing of a hidden door, like the final breath of a dying tongue. Some say it was too strange, too celestial, too damning. For in Enoch's pages, angels fall not once but willingly. The heavens leak secrets to earth. And the judgment of mankind is not far away, but already written, etched into stars and thunder. He speaks of watchers, of veiled dimensions, of cycles within cycles, where epics collapse like lungs exhaling God's forgotten names. Heaven and earth collide in this scroll, not in metaphor but in consequence. This wasn't lost because it was weak. It was lost because it was dangerous. But danger has a way of echoing. And so it survived in fragments at Qumran, sealed in jars beneath the Dead Sea. The same caves that held the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Book of the Watchers, the astronomical book, pieces of one Enoch still breathing beneath Jerusalem's forgotten dust. There are echoes in stone, yet passages scratched into forgotten walls, symbols that reappear like constellations across buried scrolls. Even the church fathers couldn't stitch the silence tight enough. Let that settle in your spirit, a book that predates the Gospels, quoted by early church writers, revered by ancient mystics, cut away not by heresy but by consensus. Who decides what is divine and what is simply too divine to allow? We begin again with Enoch, not as myth, but as memory rising from the ashes. Because maybe it was never a legend. Maybe it was a warning. A scroll waiting in smoke, breathing beneath centuries of ash, its voice sealed but unforgotten. And now that warning is awake. Do you hear it? Do you feel the tremble behind the veil? Because perhaps the book they buried begins to speak again. And still, they watch from below. It was never just lost, it was exiled. The Book of Enoch did not simply vanish into the fog of history. It was cut, cast out, and sealed away like a heretic's whisper. A sacred testament broken from the spine of Holy Writ, its pages darkened not by age, but by decree. This was no casual omission. This was a cosmic severance. A scroll too radiant, too dangerous, too awake for the chain-bound order of official canon. Imagine it: a prophet walks with angels, is shown the architecture of heaven, instructed in the choreography of stars. He returns not with myth, but with indictment, with names, with warnings, and in return he is silenced. There is something unsettling about a man who speaks not for men, but with the authority of thrones. Enoch's account, once revered among the ancient Essenes, those desert mystics who hid their scrolls in caves at Qumran, was swept from synagogue and sanctuary alike. It echoed through early Judaism and Christian apocalypse, alike referenced by church fathers like Tertullian, who called it sacred. And yet it vanished from the libraries of Rome and the rituals of Jerusalem. Stillborn truth hidden beneath chalice and crown. Its disappearance was not passive. This was spiritual warfare in manuscript form. As if what Enoch saw, angelic mutiny, celestial courts, measurements of time before time, was a mirror too clear for a politicized priesthood to stomach. Councils convened, opinions hardened, and by the time the Council of Laodicea declared which books might be read in the churches, Enoch was not among them. But the memory did not die. It lingered like embers beneath ash. In Ethiopia, the only land where the Book of Enoch survived intact, enshrined in the Ge'ez language, we see a remnant people guarding the vision. There it remained bound within the Beta Israel tradition, its verses recited with the same reverence as Genesis. A lone thread of cosmic defiance in the fabric of time-worn orthodoxy. And though forgotten by West and Rome, it haunted the edges of illuminated manuscripts and monastic whispers, casting shadows in the background of dreams, as though even silence remembered. In 1773, James Bruce stumbled into history when he returned from Abyssinia with copies of the manuscript in hand, a resurrection centuries in waiting. His discovery shook biblical scholarship like a ghost voice calling from a forgotten chamber in the collective soul. A sealed scroll breathing again. How do we explain this exile? This sacred vanishing? Some say Enoch's visions were too similar to the mysteries of ancient Babylon. Others claim it destabilized emerging dogma too wild for the delicate precision of creeds and councils. But deeper still, perhaps it struck our pride. For Enoch reminds us humanity was never alone in its fall or its fate. What do we do with a prophet who walked through heaven and came back? We listen, and we remember, because memory, in a world built on curated forgetfulness, is rebellion. And now you know the question that echoes through every burned scroll and silenced vision. If they feared his words so much, what did Enoch truly see? And still, they watch from below. It was never a legend. It was a warning, exiled from the altar, severed from the scroll, and swallowed by centuries like flame into smoke. The Book of Enoch did not vanish. It was hidden, not lost but locked, not forgotten but forbidden. And yet it waits. A shrouded scroll older than Moses, older than temple stones, flickers behind the veil of time. Quoted by Jude in the New Testament, yet banished from the Bible. Revered in Ethiopia, burned in Rome. This is no ordinary text. It walks like a phantom between worlds, part prophecy, part indictment, wholly dangerous. You see, to remember Enoch is to remember a memory older than the law. In the highlands of ancient Mesopotamia, long before Sinai thundered with commandments, the voice of Enoch stirred. A man said to have walked with God, and was no more, for God took him. Taken not by death, but by dimension. The Hebrews called him Hanok, the initiated. In his name echoes ritual secrecy and access denied to most, but not to him. This text once circulated among Second Temple Jewish sects, the Essenes curating its secrets among the caves of Qumran. Carried visions too unbearable for empire, too revealing for priesthood. Scholars like James H. Charlesworth note its presence within the Dead Sea Scrolls, ancient fragments that witness to its sacred status in pre-rabbinic Judaism. And yet it would be cast out. Why? Because Enoch does not merely comfort. Enoch accuses. He speaks of angels who fell, of forbidden knowledge taught to mortals, of a cosmic hierarchy disrupted. He peers behind the machinery of judgment, mapping dimensions that rend the sky. In his visions are wheels within wheels, thrones stitched into time, and watchers brought low by desire. This wasn't myth. It was an indictment of power. The early church fathers wrestled with it. Tertullian in the 2nd century affirmed its truth, until orthodoxy narrowed the path and the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century drew its lines. Anything too celestial, too apocalyptic, too freeing was deemed heretical, and so a fracture was sealed. The Book of Enoch disappeared from the Western canon, but not from memory, because memory, when buried, grows roots. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the only ancient Christian tradition to preserve it in full, it remained sacred. Preserved in Ge'ez, the echo of Enoch throbbed through Africa even as Europe forgot. While Western scribes scratched out Gospels, monks of Lalibela still whispered Enoch's visions word for word, as if guarding a fuse that could ignite once again. And beneath that whisper, silence. Not absence, but compression. A vibration waiting for alignment. a code waiting for permission. Now the question circles us: if a truth is exiled but not erased, what power does it still wield in the shadows of the soul? Could it be that memory is not what we recall but what awakens when we are ready? And if so, what happens when what awakens is staring back? What happens when the book begins to remember you?